So I just got to Thessaloniki from Athens, and I wanted to talk about Athens and Corinth now before I forget any of the really good details. So a couple of days ago, I flew into Athens. That was my first stop. Um, Athens was really cool. It's a really touristy city, but it's not peak season yet, so it wasn't that bad at all. Um, Athens, let's see. I got there, and one of the first things I did was go to Areopagus Hill, which is where Paul addressed the Athenians. He did that there and at the marketplace, which I guess is the Agora, probably the Roman Agora, not the Greek Agora, because Paul was there during the Roman Empire. Um, and that's where Acts says that he spent the most time talking about the gospel. So I went to Areopagus Hill the first day and probably pretty much every day after that, and would sit there and read. It's essentially this hill right beside the Acropolis. It's beautiful. It looks like a big rock outcrop, but it's so slippery because for thousands of years people have been walking up there. In ancient times, this big council would meet there, and that's why Paul was asked to go address these new things he was talking about, because it was this group of men that would talk about and let different cults come in and out of the city. Super interesting. But anyway, it's a rock outcrop, and it's just so slippery. It looks like it's not going to be, but it is. I watched a lot of people almost trip and fall. So I read Axan, then I was reading some other books. One cool thing that happened was I was reading a book about the hill in modern times, and it was oh, by the way, there's this bronze plaque at the bottom of the hill that talks in Greek, says what Paul says in Acts. It's just a direct quote from Acts, which is funny because I had seen that and had no idea what it had said, because it was in Greek, obviously, and I thought I was just explaining what the hill was. Also in Acts, Paul talks a lot about seeing how much Athens is consumed with religion. There are statues everywhere, and he talks about a statue to an unknown god even. And so that's so poignant sitting there on Areopagus Hill, looking up at the Acropolis and at the Parthenon. So I also went to the Acropolis, saw all the temples, went to the Temple of Zeus, the Acropolis Museum, a Byzantine and Christian museum, which was really cool. Essentially just trying to get a picture of historic Athens, what Paul was walking into, and yeah, what he experienced while he was there. Another thing that I learned, Paul wasn't in Athens very long. He came there from Thessaloniki, which is where I am now. Funny. And I was reading a book that says he was probably really preoccupied with, he had just planted a church, I guess you can call it that, in Thessaloniki, and there were believers there that were new in their faith. And so it talks about how anxious Paul would have been on his second journey into, but this is the first one into Europe. Yeah, so Athens was really cool. Where I was going with that. In a book I was reading, it talked about how Athens remained a really a pagan stronghold for a really, really long time, because it was so consumed with the ancient gods, because it was just so present everywhere. So my last day when I was staying in Athens, I took a day trip out to Corinth, and met up with Robin Rhodes, who is a former scholar. He now teaches archaeology at the University of Notre Dame, and got to Corinth the 12th, and I went and met him on the 13th, and he showed me around, which was the most incredible thing. Robin has been in Corinth doing research, um, like his whole life. He speaks fluent Greek, fluent ancient Greek. Like this is where he goes. He's lived in the village for years at a time. His kids went to like the local primary school there. He has so many fun stories about Corinth and about the village itself. And so it was really, really fun to spend a lot of time with him. I was there for like 7 hours. And we walked well, and he drove me to a ton of places. And he was able to explain like the historical significance of Athens. It's kind of at this cross point that everybody has to go through because it connects, like, if Greece is your hand, it connects like the thumb to the rest of Greece. And so there's a port here and or a harbor here and a harbor here. And then there's like a canal that went through in ancient times so you could get goods through. Anyway, Corinth, super powerful in ancient Greek times. A lot of myths come from Corinth. Also super powerful in Roman times. It was the Roman capital in Greece. And so it was just kind of this monumental city that meant a lot. And Robin was able to explain a lot of that to me, which was really cool. And we went to the Roman Forum, and he full on teacher mode. He takes undergrads at Corinth for like a study abroad thing for 3 weeks every summer, and so we would go look at like ruins, and he would walk me through a problem, like something he would try and have his students figure out, like which phase of this came first and why, or rebuild the temple in your mind by what's on the ground. So that was so fun, and he's so knowledgeable and was just so kind to show me around. That's for sure been one of my favorite things that I've done so far. Um, he also took me to the ancient, what's it called? It's like an amphitheater, the ancient amphitheater, and we just kind of stood there, looked in the landscape, and he was talking to me about, you know, the thing that always keeps me intrigued, doing like studying ancient things and ancient people, is like standing here in Corinth. It's just such a dynamic and magnificent landscape, and that like would have been the same. The mountains are the same. The sea is the same. Like the view that we're looking at is the same view that Paul would have had when writing Romans. So that was just a really cool thing to think about and conceptualize. So now I'm in Thessaloniki, and I'm gonna walk around and see the Roman Forum and a bunch of other things. So today I left Thessaloniki for Kavila, so I'm going to talk about Thessaloniki for a little bit. Thessaloniki was really cool. It's the second biggest city in Greece, so definitely not as big or as touristy as Athens, but still pretty big. So I started off and I went to probably the biggest landmark in the city, which is the White Tower. It's like right on the sea, because in the White Tower, although it was built like a lot later than Paul, it has a really good like museum of Thessaloniki, like the history of the city. So that was a really good place to kind of start off. Um, I was also, while I was also there, I went to their archaeological museum, and got to see like a lot of ancient relics. Thessaloniki is like Athens, like a super ancient city. They have been around for a while and have been a really important like central location in Macedonia. So it's cool just to look at all of the things that they found there and just like learn more about the city and imagine what life would have looked like. While I was also there, I went to this really old, like beautiful Byzantine church. It was built in like the 4th century. Not the current like thing that's standing, but originally. Um, it was just like really cool to sit in there and think about like what Paul had like written to the Thessalonians um, in his letters, and how he always like talked about um, what like joy they brought him. It was really cool to go like from Corinth to there, because just like the nature of the like letter to the Corinthians versus like Thessalonians is so different, because the Corinthians like had a lot of issues in their church, and Paul just talks about like what a joy the Thessalonians are. So that was really cool to think about. Um, let's see. I also went to the old Roman Forum in the city, and kind of got to look around and just imagine what it would have looked like, and got to practice some very like similar techniques that I did with Professor Rhodes when I was in Corinth, of looking what was laying on the ground and imagining like what the city would have looked like once. So on my way from Thessaloniki to Kavala, I stopped in Philippi, which wasn't the initial plan, but it worked out really well, because it was just able to be like a super quick stop, and I didn't have to take like a whole day to go back out there from Kavala. So Philippi was like the biggest archaeological site like I've seen yet, like bigger than like almost what's going on in the Acropolis, much bigger than what they've excavated in Corinth. It was just massive, like different levels of it. They had an amphitheater excavated, and just like whole like layers. You could see it go down, and how late they were digging versus like the different periods, like the Greek period, the Roman period, because it's all levels, because the Roman period is going to be on top of the Greek period because it came later. Anyway, it was super cool to just walk around Philippi and just see the scale of the city. Philippi is no longer a big city in Greece, it's just ruins. So it's kind of like a little park. There are a lot of Greek students there on like field trips. And it was like a major city back in the day, but kind of after the 1st century got destroyed in a war, and just never came back to prominence, unlike like Corinth or Thessaloniki. So it was just really cool to see the scale of it. I think that's been my favorite thing so far on this trip, is just to see all these different cities and like think about like what they would have looked like, and look around at the scenery and be like, this is what it would have been like to be here in the 1st century when Paul was here. In Philippi, they have like a bunch of different things, like labeled as, oh, like Paul was here. This is like one of the reasons why this city is important. They even have like this excavated thing that they call like Paul's prison, because Paul was put in prison when he was visiting the Philippians, just very briefly. I don't know if that's actually his prison, or if they're just like taking a stab at it, but it was still cool to like see and think about like, oh, that actually happened, and that was maybe here. So Philippi was just really cool just to see really the scale of the city, and what it would have looked like, and like where it was situated in the Greek countryside. And so I had a really good time, and it was just, there was nobody there. That's been like the craziest thing about all of these sites, is that you just can walk around and walk all over, and there just really aren't that many tourists there. Like there were a lot of little kids at the park, but out on the actual site, there were more like lawn people than there were tourists per se. So it's really cool to like kind of be by myself looking at this and like really thinking about it. So Kabbalah was super cool. Um, it's the starting point of like where Paul first came into Europe. So it was where like Christianity first entered Europe, which is kind of wild to think about. Um, they have a really old church there. Doesn't date back to Paul, but they have a really pretty mosaic outside of the church that is like commemorative of Paul landing in Kabbalah and just Christianity entering Europe because that's such a big deal. Kabbalah obviously sits on the coast. And it's just like this beautiful little Greek town. And so Paul didn't spend a ton of time there. He pretty much went there to Philippi, which is why I was staying there, is because Philippi is like ruins now, and Kavala is like the nearest biggest city. But it was still cool to go there, especially after visiting Philippi, and just like reflect on um, the fact that like Christianity almost as a worldwide religion kind of started there as it entered Europe. And it was cool that that was my last place in Greece because I like left Kavala and went straight to Rome, which is like, I mean, the capital of the Catholic Church, and like the splendor, I guess, and like what Christianity became kind of smacks you in the face there, which isn't necessarily the case in Kavala. So it was just like an interesting contrast to witness.
I feel just like a sailboat. I don't know where I'm headed.
Rome was incredible. I've been to Rome before, but didn't remember it fondly, and just kind of remembered it as this gross big city. But I got there a couple days ago, and it's just what like everything's just so big. It like gets lost on you after you've been there for a second because you just like leave the airport or the train station and just like every single building is massive, like decorated, crazy, like sculptures everywhere, beautiful fountains everywhere. And so that was wild. One of the days I was there, one of the first days I was there, I went to St. Paul's Basilica, which is where like Christian, it's not really, I don't know, Christian legend or the Catholic Church or whatever believes that that's where Paul was buried. It's a little bit outside of like the main area of the city. So it was cool. I didn't know what to expect, but it's a massive basilica, absolutely massive, and nobody's really there. So you walk in and it's this huge open space. It kind of reminds you of like the Vatican at like St. Peter's Basilica. Just the scale of it because it was so big. And right up by the altar, they have like a glass panel where you can see down into the excavations, which is like where they say Paul's tomb is. And above the altar, they have like this box with like, it has like a chain in it. And they say that that chain is like what held Paul. But it was kind of a wild thing to reflect on as I went there, thinking about like all the places that I'd been in the last couple weeks in Greece, and like all the places Paul went and like started ministries, and to end in Rome where he was killed, and like at the place where he was buried stands this like massive, massive, massive church, and like Rome itself, like a testament to like how large Christianity became. It was also a little bit crazy to think about like how nice everything is after like reading so many of Paul's letters, like pretty like one a day for the last several weeks. It probably struck me that he wouldn't super love all of these massive grand churches where all this money went into like artwork and sculptures, where that money could have been going to like help other people or like be sent to missionary somewhere. I don't know. It was kind of an interesting to think about. Anyway, St. Paul's Basilica, really, really cool. So the Pantheon was super cool. It's this massive ancient building, like in the heart of Rome. You kind of like stumble upon it almost. You don't really see it from a distance, and so you just like enter the square and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing is crazy. It's the largest concrete dome anywhere in the world, freestanding concrete dome anywhere in the world, and has been for like 2,000 years. It used to be a temple, but was converted to a church pretty early on, and is still like a basilica and a church today. It's just crazy, the scale of it and the history of it and how old it is, and that it's still a working church. So that was really, I love the Pantheon. It's just so cool. There's so many cool things about it. Like the columns are from Egypt. They floated them down the Nile and then put them like across the Mediterranean for the Pantheon. I don't know. It was so fun to think about. And then one day I did the Vatican, of course, which again, I've been there before, but it was a different experience of just like reflection, and especially given like what I've been doing the last several weeks, to end at the Vatican, one of my last days in Rome, and just kind of like St. Paul's Basilica, like look at just how grand it is, and just what Christianity started as and what it became, and just to look at all the artwork. And I don't know, the Vatican is crazy. If you've been there, you know, like the letters on the ceiling, they say are like 3 meters tall and they look tiny. It's just, the scale of it's incredible. So it's fun to see the artwork. That was kind of my favorite, to see like the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo's paintings. Yeah, I really like the Vatican. I really like Rome. Just, I think the biggest thing I'm taking away is it's just so big. Like everything there is so big. Buildings that would be impressive in other cities are just like nothing in Rome, because everything's impressive.
World's gonna burn. It's all coming down, but I hope we learn, for we're buried in the ground.